The fact that you are trending on Twitter right now since early this morning. Can you tell us a little bit about why that is, what's been going on?
Yes, this morning I decided to post a video about something that happened in Paris a couple of days ago. So I was sitting at the terrace of a cafe having an interview, and a man passed by and just insulted me. Insulted the color of my skin. And then he was just walking with his girlfriend, and he just turned around the corner. So as he was smiling, I didn't really realize what he was saying, but you know, his last words really ring the bell. So I decided to go after him, and thanks God, the videographer who was with me asked me if I wanted him to come with me. And I just found him sitting at another cafe like 50 meters further in a terrace. So I came to him and I filmed. I came to him to ask him why he said that, and he started getting crazy, trying to start a fight with the videographer to get my phone, and I taped everything. And his girlfriend supported him, and she just dismissed me, like, okay, why are you here? You said what you have said what you have to say, and I didn't hear the same. And the other thing that was good is that what he said was on tape because it was filmed. So it took me some days because I didn't want to post the video with his face. Because to me, the most important thing was to have him being identified, but to go on a trial, to sue him. And I didn't want that to turn into, you know, cyberbullying or people just assaulting him because of what he said to me. So I just blurred his face and I posted the video today, and I got much support. And it helped me having some information about them. That's what I can say. And my lawyer is on the case, so the plainte, I don't know the word in English. Yeah, the complaint will be ready very, very soon.
Has anything like that happened to you before?
It's the first time. Like, I've never experienced something like that, and I was like, mostly when people recognize me in the streets, they're always nice. And I guess that people who don't like me recognize me in the streets, but they didn't say anything. So it's the first time. And what I can say is that he passed by, and I think that he thought that they wouldn't have any consequence. So he just passed by and left. So he just threw his words and just left me on the terrace. And it's the first time it ever happened to me.
Do you know I don't know if it's like what the nature of his, what was the nature of his insult? Was it just pure racism, or did he have a specific?
I can it's so trigger warning. It's offensive, but he told me, like, my name, Rokhaya Diallo, you smell like shit. And then he walked like 10 meters, and he stopped and turned around and said, and I don't say that because shit is brown. He's black, actually. He didn't say brown, he said black. And I was shocked. And when I confronted him with his word, he was like, it has nothing to do with your skin. I just don't like what you say. And he denied the fact that it was insulting or racist.
Yeah. I mean, this gets to sort of what we want to talk about today with you and with Lindsey is, you know, there's the conversation about race in France is very different than it is in the United States. And a lot of people don't want to have it. And Rokhaya, you spend a lot of time just kind of convincing people that it's a conversation we should be having here. Can you kind of explain what that's like?
It's very difficult because we have like a strong national denial about the fact that race exists in France. So even myself, being raised as a French woman, I was raised in the fallacy of colorblindness. So to me, race wasn't a thing. It was just, you know, a characteristic among others, but I didn't really understand it as a social fact, because we have that doctrine in France, that is universalism, that says that France doesn't recognize any race. And it's beautiful in theory, but for real, race has an effect. And it took me like being an adult to understand that I was not only a French woman, but also a Black woman, which makes me being treated very differently from my friends who are white. And my difficulty now is just to make people accept the conversation about race, because the most common idea is that we are all the same, and that France doesn't recognize race. So speaking about it would create racism, and that race is an American conversation. So trying to speak about it is trying to import something that never happens in France. And it's very difficult, because when you start to speak about that, people call you racist. Like they say you are racist because you are focusing on race.
Lindsey, speaking of American conversations, you're an American who moved to Paris about 15 years ago, I think. Yeah. And you have been writing about Paris ever since, about how Paris doesn't follow the sort of stereotypes that you had about it. Can you tell us what was the impetus for writing your new book?
Well, so interestingly, some of these injustices that, Rokhaya is mentioning, the sort of what life is really like for people, follows what I was trying to do with the first book, which was sort of, let's challenge what we know to be true about Paris, and also let's challenge what we think to be true about its people. And yes, all French people are stereotyped to some degree, but no one greater than the Parisian woman, I would say. And so when I set out to do this, it was to say that all of the stereotypes that do exist, and they are rampant. I mean, we're talking about, the image that we see time and time again is some variation on a similar theme, which is that she's white, she's thin, she is definitely heterosexual, she is probably pretty affluent, and
on a Vespa, smoking a cigarette.
Yeah, among other sort of very superficial kind of features. And it's like, well, where is everybody else? Because as someone who lives here, we're not seeing only that. In fact, that would represent, if anything, it represents a small percentage of the women that exist. So the fact that it's an incomplete story of who the women are, I think is very problematic. And among the reasons are sort of what Rokhaya was starting to say, which is that, there's a whole multitude of women that we see here who are from all backgrounds, who are not necessarily born in France. I mean, obviously I wasn't born in France, and yet this is where my life is. And I'm one of, thousands and thousands of other people who are not, who have made this their home and who have become French and are not native. And it's a very problematic myth for all of the people who can't, for whatever reason, fit into a certain mold. And so I think it's a very dangerous image that continues to be perpetuated, and also is, commodified by companies and tourism boards and advertising agencies, because it sells a lot of money, but ultimately it's not a reflection of reality.
Yeah. Rokhaya, how you talked about your sort of coming of age and realizing that being a Black woman was part of who you were here. How did you first start becoming, there are no job advertisements for anti-racism activists in Le Monde. How did you get started on that road?
Actually, I totally agree with what Lindsey said about the vision that we have about the Parisian. I was born and raised in Paris. And as a child, I grew up in a very diverse neighborhood. So being Black wasn't a thing, because many of my friends in school were Asian, were North African, had parents who were from other countries who had accents. So it wasn't something very, very significant to be Black. But the more I advanced in my studies, the less there were people looking like me. And at some point, I focused much attention from people who would ask me where I was from. So, I'm very proud of my origins, but I'm from here. I'm from Paris. So whenever I answered, I'm from Paris, people were like, yes, but before, where were you? And I had to explain that there was no before, because I was like, my very first experience of life was Paris. And I started to ask myself why people couldn't understand that I could be someone from here, even if, if you exclude my skin color, everything, can make people understand that I'm Parisian. So that's how I started my activism, because I understood that there were no images of women like me in the films, in the medias, and that it was one of the reasons why people didn't even see me as someone, being part of the national fabric. And it was not only me, it was also my friends who are Asian, who are from North African descent or from the Caribbean. They didn't even exist as individuals in the collective imagination. So that's when I decided to start my organization, Les Indivisibles. But the other reason was the way minorities were depicted in the media. So either we were invisible or we were only covered as problems, like when there were uprisings to speak about Islam, but in a very negative way. It was impossible to be just an average citizen. So those two reasons made me want, with some other friends, to tackle, to redefine the French identity, to have it being more inclusive.
Mm-hmm. When you are now a role model to many young women. When you were growing up, did you have role models at all in France that you felt looked like you and resembled you?
No, as a child, and it's one of the topic of my last documentary, which is about Black French actors and actresses, and I asked them how, when they saw for the first time, people who look like them on the French TV or in cinema. I didn't have anyone looking like me as a child when I watched TV. When it was the case, it was very offensive. Like, you would see Africans who were cannibals. Do we say cannibals in English? Cannibal? Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, so like cannibals, people who were savage. And something really changed. The way I saw Black people on TV, it was like the American series. Mm-hmm. And when the series Fresh Prince arrived in France, it was a relief for many Black French, because for once we saw a Black family that would make envious everyone, and that everyone would identify to. And I think that many people were glad to have American series, and especially American Black series, to see something else, because it took, like, now it's different. We have some, Black and brown figures in the French media, even if it's not enough. But in the 80s, in the 90s, like, there was, I remember there was a cookie, which name was Bamboula. And like Bamboula, it means like sambo in English. And it was the name of the cookie. And the kid who was representing the cookie was a Black kid with a fabric made of panther print. Uh-huh. And he was like living in the jungle, and like the cookie was sold as if it was nothing. And it's like one of the few animated figures who was Black that I saw on TV.
Lindsey, you write in your book about the Parisian woman and how the image of her was formed, and this sort of monolithic image. Where did this come from?
Well, it has a very long history. It goes, long before Chanel and the Parisian figure as sort of like a hegemonic branded figure. We saw elements of her even in Jean-Jacques Rousseau's work. So in the 18th century, one particular work of his, which was widely read, was Julie, or the New Eloise. And he depicted her really across social classes as inordinately concerned with fashion and artifice as a symbol of status. And also that she was particularly concerned with drawing attention to herself, and she was very talented at seduction. And then that transferred and evolved and became a focus on Parisian elegance and refinement in dress and manner. And then that too sort of shifted from just being applied to the elite and into the, modest working girl. And then you can see it evolve quite drastically when we get to the Belle Epoque, and you have structured prostitution and pleasure houses. And it started to feed the notion that I think many people still have today of the woman as sort of like an erotic figure. So there's that. And then on the other side, you have, the connection to fashion. So you have the first department store, which was Le Bon Marché. And for those who don't know, that actually inspired Macy's and Selfridges, which I found fascinating. And that store was really crucial in cultivating this image of a woman who was modern and fashionable. The owners developed seasonal fashions and even had like sales promotions, and it allowed women to really start reinventing themselves constantly. And more than that, it gave women job opportunities. So there were women who didn't live in Paris who came and found sort of financial empowerment, because it was a time when it was almost impossible for a woman to have any kind of job or independence without any kind of permission for her husband.
And we as Americans have been big consumers of this idea of the French woman. We love it. We buy perfumes that are called La Parisienne and all that.
Totally. And so it really began, you know, in the late 19th century. And then by the time you get to around World War II, many of these images had already started to be exported. And I don't really go into the GIs, the American GIs in the book, but I did do a little bit of quick research. And what's really interesting actually is that what was the sort of messaging that was prevalent then really relates to the images that Rousseau had even started depicting much, you know, generations before. So there was a pocket guide in 1944 that was distributed to GIs who were going to be in France, and it warned them about pursuing relationships with local Parisian women. And they were told that most Parisians were not the flirtatious and sexually promiscuous women that were depicted in popular culture. The guide did, however, use words that portrayed women in a similar way to the past, so that they were masterful at seduction, they were often wicked and frivolous, and ultimately they were just sexual objects. Yeah. So I did find that interesting, and Chanel comes into play around this time as well, and you know how she totally revolutionized fashion and freeing women from these very oppressive garments. But I would say that some of the images that remain today, and I think it's why the image hasn't changed all that much, is that what's sold and what continues to sell, you know, billions in dollars of product and sort of fantasy is both Chanel, and then even further along Brigitte Bardot in the 60s and 70s as this sort of like sexually liberated, you know, completely free and bohemian woman. You know, it doesn't matter that Brigitte Bardot is not even a Parisian.
It's interesting to look at modern Paris versus the stereotype. And one problem we have, Rokhaya, looking at the stereotypes is that there are really very few statistics. Can you tell us a little bit about why those statistics aren't kept in France?
So it's really connected to what I said earlier, the idea that the French Republic is universalist, and that you cannot distinguish among the citizens who is, you can make the distinction between French and non-French, but then among French we should be all the same because it's the ideology that prevails. The other thing is that I think that the World War II really originated a major trauma, because the last time that the government collected statistics, it was meant to deport Jews, French Jews. So people are here, and I really understand why, are not really comfortable having data that could be used very wrongly by any institution. And I think that many of the people, the anti-racist fight in France has been structured around the fight against anti-Semitism, like the LDH, the Human Rights League, was founded around l'affaire Dreyfus, which was a case of a French officer who was a victim of anti-Semitism, and then l'ICRA was also founded after the death of a Jew French in the streets of Paris. So this idea of having statistics is also connected to the idea of singling out some of the citizens.
But as an activist, are you arguing for more support?
I'm totally in favor, because saying that the Republic has been able to be very hypocrite. Like, for example, during the colonization, there were different status of French. So you had the French citizens, but also the French subjects who were the indigènes. And it was a different code that applied to them. So, there was also the status of French Muslims. So the Republic has been able to produce data whenever it was needed, whenever it was okay for its purpose. So to me, it's very important to have information. And actually, statistics are not really banned. You can conduct studies. Like, for example, in a university, it's possible to conduct study. What is forbidden is to connect an identity, the identity of someone, with a racial mention. Like, for example, it's not possible to have that in a census. But if you want to study race, it's possible as long as people are not identified. Mm-hmm. So, but to me, it's a very important tool. For example, I use that to tackle police brutality. But what we use is people who declare themselves and say, I'm perceived as Black or Arab, and I'm treated this or that way by the police. Then it's possible. But I think that the lack of data really doesn't help us. It doesn't help because it makes France think of itself as a white country. And it really erases all the, but it's not only the statistics, it's also the languages, for example. Like the fact that in the Constitution, French shall be the language of the Republic means that, you know, all the French who are in overseas departments have their languages who are not really recognized. Or even like in the mainland, like the Basque or the Britons, they don't really have a status regarding, or the people in Corsica, they don't have a status regarding their culture. So it's very, like it's the theory of assimilation. And to me, it's not something very positive for the minorities.
Mm-hmm. If I might jump in, I had one comment for Rokhaya, which was, you wrote this piece after race was removed from the Constitution in 2018, which was so powerful because ultimately what you were saying is that it was removed for these same sort of almost like as a way of saying, see, we're colorblind, we don't want it in the Constitution, but actually, you know, it simply means that it sort of emphasizes how uncomfortable they still are at the idea of addressing or even discussing the discriminations that do exist.
Exactly, I totally agree. It's like, because in the Constitution, the word was first put in the Constitution to say that there would be no discrimination due to race. So if you remove that line, like what ground do you have to fight racism? And there is this idea that if we don't speak about race, racism will disappear like magically. And it doesn't work like that. And I get constantly the accusation of being, you know, the one who creates division. And I say that just commenting something that is happening, whether I say it or not, is not creating division. It's just acknowledging the fact that they exist and trying to find a way to go further and to go to another step. But it's a real taboo. Like in France, it's so difficult. You know, there is another case that is interesting. Like in February, during the Césars Awards, so it's the French equivalent to the Oscars, the Black actress Aïssa Maïga came in front of the public, and she started to count Black people in the room, and everybody was shocked that she counted Black people. I was shocked because she counted only 6 Black people. Like I was like everybody is after her because she says she named them because she knew all of them. And everybody were like, oh, she's counting Black people. That is so offensive. That is so, you know, against our French philosophy. It's so American. We cannot tolerate that. And I was like, so your problem is not that in that room that is representing the French cinema, you cannot find more than 6 Black people. So it's yeah.
Rokhaya, it's interesting as an American to be having this conversation with you because famously, so many famous Black American artists have come to France to escape racism and to say that they finally felt like, you know, you have someone like James Baldwin saying he finally felt like an American when he was in France. Can you explain a little bit about why this might be?
It's very interesting because France has a very, very good image among African Americans because of that part of the 20th century when James Baldwin, Josephine Baker, or Chester Rhimes, and many other African American artists went to France to escape segregation. But the thing that people forget is that at that time, France was also colonizing Africa. So at the time, African Americans were enjoying the Parisian life. My parents were colonized, so they were not even citizens. And it's very, and you know, during the colonization, so slavery was abolished, but forced work was still possible until 1946. So while Josephine Baker was a big star in Paris, you had people in Africa who were working for nothing, and they were not officially slaves, but it was the same. So that, and there has always been that double standard. Like, it was, when I was a kid, it was okay to have Black Americans on screen, but not Black French. And today, if you come to Paris and you're Black and you're checked by the police, as soon as you speak English, you're okay. And there is also, so African American still experience Paris in a very different way as you know, Black French. But for me, it's the same. Like, if I go to the US and people understand that I'm French, and so I'm not African American, I become only a French person. So I'm questioned about fashion and things like that, but I understand that I'm not part of your history. So I'm not seen as someone who has an argument to settle with the country. Yeah. So yeah, but it's very interesting because it's always, you know, whenever we try to compare racism in the France and in the US, you have many people who say, no, France has never been racist because there were so many jazzmen who came in Paris. And the thing that they love to say is that those Black men could date white women, as if it was the ultimate goal of any Black person to date someone white. So it's like, it's very interesting. And I can't prevent myself to say yes, but at the same time, my family was struggling to get freedom in Africa from the French Republic. So no, it was not okay.
Sorry, Lindsey, you want to say something?
No, I was just going to say that you bring up a point that is super relevant to the movement we've been experiencing worldwide, obviously, but even in France with the anti-racist movement. Rokhaya, one of the things that I noticed in the last 2 weeks was how in mainstream media, there's this instant desire to compare what's going on here with the US, as though, you know, well, we can point fingers to the US because on a spectrum of egregious to not that bad, France, people think, falls into this like not that bad category, as though that's the way we should be looking at these issues in the first place. But why do you think the sort of the French intellectual circle, which tends to be the people who are debating these issues, even though it should be much broader, why do you think they kind of fall into this trap of just saying, well, look at the US, we're not like that?
I think it's because it's very comfortable to say that we do better than the other countries and that we have a different mindset. And what I like to say is that, okay, the countries are different, it's obvious, but France was one of the major slave countries. It was like the second biggest colonial empire. And it's the only country today in 2020 to be present on the 5 continents. So like, it's former colonies that have been departmentalized. So that means that we have the consequences of colonizations are still here on our soil. And having this idea that, you know, you can be a slave and colonial power and all the consequences of racism disappearing like that, like in just you know, some decades, it doesn't make sense. But I think that the difference is that, like everything in the US, whether it's the genocide of the native population, the colonization, the deportation of African, everything happened on the same soil. But in France, it was far away. It was in the Caribbean, in the Indian Ocean, in Africa, in Asia. So that it's very easy today to say, we don't know, we've not seen anything. But in the US, I think there is no way you can avoid anything that is related to race, because it has shaped the country.
But what about the educational system? Because it seems, obviously I didn't do my, you know, the core of my education in France, but I know from, you know, from speaking to you and from people who have raised their kids here, that colonial past, even if it did happen, that this violence was taking place outside of sort of their, their mainland, that it's not even part of the, school system. It's not part of the fundamentals of your education in France. And so they're never even learning about it.
Like, it has changed a little bit from the early 2000s, because there was a law, the La Loi Taubira, the Taubira law, about slavery. So it's more in the curriculum. But the thing, for example, about colonization is that I remember that I learned decolonization. Like, you learn everything about how it ended, but you don't really learn the colonial system. So I learned myself about things that I learned from my family, things that I learned from activists, but you don't really learn that. And for example, you don't learn that there is this debate also today here about the statues. And there is the statue of Colbert, who is in front of the National Assembly, which is the French Congress. And Colbert is very known for being one of the most prominent political figures during the monarchy. He was the Minister of Finance, and he created the modern accountability. But he's also the author of the Black Code. And the Black Code was the code for that made Black people slaves and furniture. And he also created the Company of India, which was the structure, the company that was in charge of the slave trade. So, but nobody knows that about him. And his statue is just in front of the palace, and inside the building, you have several rooms which are named after him. And you never know that. So you have avenues, you have metro stations who are named after torturers, after colonialists, after slaves, after slave owners or slave torturers, and you don't really learn about that. And that's something that is not good. And you don't even learn about how, like, for example, if you are French and you live in a department that is overseas, you don't learn about your own territory. Like, you learn about France, like the European part of France, but you don't learn about your own geography, about the history of the land you live in. And it's very, very difficult. There is a major denial about the fact that France is structurally built, the modern France is built on racism.
I wanted to bring it up into the current moment a little bit, because as I think a lot of people in America have heard of the filmed murder of George Floyd in America, really reverberated around the world, in places like Brazil and Kenya, and France is certainly a place where it resonated very much. And it made people, it brought new attention to the murder of a French 24-year-old, Black 24-year-old, Adama Traoré. And can you talk a little bit about how the message from America and the Protest America arrived in France? And, is this a big moment in France in terms of racial awareness?
I think it is. What is very sad and interesting at the same time is that whenever there is a racist murder in the US, the French media are very good for covering it. Like, they cover it, they really analyze institutional racism in the US. They say that one is Black, the other is white. They say that very precisely. Mm-hmm. And I think that what really motivated the Comité Adama, who is in charge of seeking for justice for Adama Traoré, is that they saw that, the French media were very comfortable saying that George Floyd was Black, that the police officer was white, and that it was not covered in the same way in France. So the skin color of Adama Traoré was never mentioned, and the coverage of George Floyd's death implied that it was something so American. And that's the reason why the Comité Adama decided to start a protest, a first rally, just to raise awareness on France and to say, okay, we're really sad for what happened in the US, but let us not do as if it didn't happen here. And I think it really echoed with many of the questions that because it was a young generation, young French people had in mind.
Mm-hmm. What Americans don't don't know so much about is that France has this, the French police do these, they call them identity checks, and they can basically stop anyone they want and ask and put them up against the wall and ask to see their ID. And it happens disproportionately to young Black and Muslim men in these poor neighborhoods. And there's no, and often these kids are 10 or 11 years old, these boys are, and that is their first interaction with the police. And that's what happened with Adama. He was killed during an identity check.
Yes, actually, yeah, it's because like we know that if you are Black or perceived as Arab, you are 20, and if you're a man, a young man, you are 20 times more likely to be checked than anyone else. So that means that you are 20 times or even more likely to face police brutality. And Adama, so he was arrested because he tried to escape because he didn't have his ID, and then he was arrested and he died in custody. We know that the 3 police officers weighed their 3 bodies on his back, so they admitted that, even if they changed afterwards their version. But and it happens all the time. Like for example, tomorrow there will be a rally to commemorate Lamine Dieng, who died in 2007. He was arrested by 8 police officers, and many of them went on his back, and he was asphyxiated. So also a young Black man, and it's something that is not understood by the media as something related to race. And the change that is occurring now is that it's possible now to have a conversation on race, and even if most of the people in the media deny it, at least we're having the conversation.
Yeah, and the sister of Adama Traore, Assa Traore, has become a major anti-racism figure as well, and that she seems to be an important new voice in this conversation. Another woman, yes, Lindsey, in part of the conversation here.
Another woman. But you know what's so interesting about this is, you know, a lot of us, obviously the Americans, but not only, have been very vocal about, you know, sort of documenting the demonstration and the movement here. And what I found in this last 2 weeks of having conversations, even with, you know, fellow French people, is just how quick they are to say, let's not be so hasty. Let's not say that what Adama Traore went through was somehow equivalent or at all comparable to what happened to George Floyd. And they go quickly to this idea that we're importing this Americanized perspective and analysis of what happens here. And I think that's sort of the dance and the cycle that keeps repeating, is that every time there are these, you know, very well documented incidents of racial profiling and violence by the hands of the police, is that it goes quickly to, no, we don't have systemic racism here. We don't have this kind of, you know, Americanized behavior. And they just refuse to see it because, again, they can hide behind the lack of data. They can hide behind, you know, the scandalous idea of talking about race. And so this sort of cycle keeps continuing. But I would say
so does this feel like a critical moment in France, the way it feels like it may be a critical moment in the US for making real systemic change, or is it just the beginning of a conversation here, or another cycle?
What do you think, Rokhaya?
I think that something is changing because I've been working for some time on race, and I remember that people wouldn't even consider what I say or understand. And the fact that we are, for example, for the first time, I think, speaking publicly and widely about whiteness is something very new. Because, and it's very interesting because people, they're not comfortable saying Black or Arab, but they do. But I see now commentators saying, about white privilege, and they say white, okay, yeah, I say white, I know it's not really, sorry for saying that, but apparently it's the way we speak about white people now. So I think that there is a discomfort speaking about white people, but thanks to the open letter that was published by Virginie Despentes, who is a novelist, it really forced everyone to think about whiteness and how it operated in the French society. So it's to me, we are living something very new. I've attended several protests against police brutality, And the two last I attended were very different from the ones I used to attend. So there were many people, many young people, and many white people. So it's something is happening. And I think that there is a new generation who is much more likely and ready to confront the society with all the racial oppression. And it's the same generation that is also working against patriarchy and trying to how can I say that, to challenge climate change.
Mm-hmm. We're getting a number of questions on chat about language and the language that's used in French. You talked about white people try to say they're white. I don't know if they say that in French or in English, but in terms of, we've heard that in France, people prefer not to say noir, they prefer to say black. How does that work? What are the rules?
It's like the function of the taboo. People don't know how to name minorities, so they'd rather say black in English than noir, which is interesting because it's still there is still this idea that race is not something French. If you don't say noir and you say black, it means that you're referring to something that is American or English at least. But yeah, it's changing, and it's difficult for the older generation, and but it's changing. It's something that we hear more and more. But you will never hear, so for example, a high-profile politician using very easily those words. You will hear people say, for example, that white privilege doesn't exist. You have heard, for example, Jean-Luc Mélenchon, who is the head of the biggest party in the left. He said that white privilege was I don't know, a nonsense. And you hear that a lot, but not really, not any question about whiteness, about minorities being targeted as minorities, because the most, like the dominant discourse would say that class is much more important and prevalent than race. And so class should be the only focus.
Mm-hmm. Well, another focus, a kind of intersection in the racism debate is the religion debate, because many Black people in France are also Muslim. And obviously you have a huge immigration from the Maghreb, and you have the children and grandchildren of that immigration. So the dominant minority in France is Muslim. So how does that intersect with the debate over race?
I think it's a very interesting question, because it shows how we're not American. So because the minorities that are more, that are the most targeted by the public discourse are Muslims. So when you say Muslims, it means Arabs, because I don't think that many of the Black people who are Muslims are seen as Muslims. And to me, it refers as the legacy of the colonialism, because there was the status during the colonization of French Muslims, Français musulmans, in Algeria. And I think that Muslims impersonate how can I say that, the challenge, how can I say, impersonate the fear that is very common in the French public discourse. So most of the racist discourses those last 15 years have targeted Muslims. So it's and even if there is a very strong historical anti-Blackness sentiment, there is also this idea that if you are French, you need to assimilate. And if you assimilate, we won't see anything that reminds that you may have another culture. So there has been a very, very strong fight against the Muslim headscarf for Muslim women, and all of the signs that may remind that someone is Muslim, because there is this idea that Frenchness doesn't allow you to look differently than what we see as someone French, truly French.
Mm-hmm. Except that with the laws of, or the policy of laïcité, which is supposed to be, I mean, it's the French version of secularism, it's supposed to allow people the ability to practice whatever they want in the comfort of their home. You know, so it's not supposed to be something that's policed or, removed entirely from someone's identity. So it's a very contradictory policy.
It's also an interesting contrast with the US, where you don't have anyone questioning whether Black Americans are really American. And in France, the whole challenge is to Black French people is to say they're not really French, as you were saying, Rokhaya. And so it's a very different conversation in that respect.
Yes, it is. It is, and I think it maybe our experience is closer to the one of the Latinx community. The Latinx community, because they have this they are targeted by the anti-immigration discourses, and they are from the racist perspective, they are seen as not being really American, some of them, and as challenging like the American identity, especially with the language. So maybe I would say that the experience is closer to that experience of people who originated from other countries. But there are also a part of the Black people who are from the Caribbean and who are from slave descent, but they are totally invisible as being from slave descent in the public sphere. So like people forget that we have a significant part of the French citizens who have a story that is very close, a history that is very close to the one of the African Americans.
Yeah, we're getting a number of questions, and we'll have to end soon, but on the chat about anti-Semitism in France. And unfortunately, it seems that people in the French Muslims are more likely to be anti-Semitic than the general population. There's some competition. It comes from the Algerian history. How do you see this, Rokhaya? Do you see any improvement on this front?
I think it's a very difficult question because there has been a structural and state racism against and state anti-Semitism, and there has been a very good work that was made by Jewish activists to make the state recognize its responsibility and to include that history in the public mind, in the
and there's a great Holocaust program in French schools. You can't go to a French school without learning about that, right?
Exactly. So that's something that is like an example, according to me. But there is also how can I say that there is I think that most of the French people, even if I think that there is still a very deep anti-Semitism that is historical here, most of the people understand that it's not okay to say anti-racist, anti-Semitic things publicly anymore. It's something that people, whenever they are caught saying things like that, they would very quickly present their apologize. They would apologize very quickly because there is a very big sensitivity to that. And there is also, I can't really explain that, but I know that it has been very difficult for many Jews to be public at certain times. There have been like terrorist attacks. France, we have to say it, but it's the only place where Jews have been killed before the attacks in the synagogue in the US. But you know, the Mohamed Merah attack in a school, and then the attack in the supermarket in 2015. It's something very specific to France. So it means that it has to do with something here because it doesn't happen in other European countries. And I don't know if it's a sense of competition, like there is the minority that is recognized as having suffered from a genocide by the government, and maybe some others that is not that are still struggling to be included in the national narrative. And I can only say that there is a problem, obviously, but to understand it and to explain it is kind of difficult to me, because I know, and it makes me sad, but more and more Jewish citizens feel uncomfortable in France and are willing to leave or not to live in certain neighborhoods, or to put their children in religious schools. So that there is a division that didn't exist earlier.
Mm-hmm. I do think some of it goes back to the Algerian history, where French Jews were made citizens and French Muslims were not, and that resentment that was but again, it becomes a question of who is really French. And I think, you know, I think French Muslims might think that French Jews are more French than they are, whereas French Jews might feel that they are not fully, it becomes a complicated
yes, it is.
conversation.
And I think it has to do a lot with yes, what you say about the Décret Crémieux, who was voted to, it's like always the same in the colonization, it's divide and conquer. So you take a minority, you give the minority more rights, and then you start a division. So there is this resentment from the past, but also from the public discourse, because there is and I think that the other thing is that the Holocaust happened on the French soil, the mainland, and it doesn't create the same guilt. Like some things that happened in Africa, in Asia, or in the Caribbean doesn't really create the same guilt than knowing that people were deported from Drancy, which is in the Parisian suburbs, or knowing that La Rafle du Veldiv happened right in the middle of Paris. So I think that the relationship to the genocide of the Jews is different because it's closer in our minds and also in geography.
Yeah, such a loaded issue.
Yeah, Lindsey, I just wanted to go back to you for the very end. Do you see the image of the Parisienne, especially Parisian women, changing now? Or you've certainly contributed to that with your new book?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think through the work of women like Rokhaya and, you know, the 39 other women who I put forward in the book, I think are a testament to, I mean, they're a small sample, but of what's really going on here. These women who, you know, are from all backgrounds, who, you know, are from Lebanon, Lithuania, from Mexico, from in the heart of Paris, or from the suburbs. And I think the reality is we need to start changing that narrative and presenting the women as they are, because that will help shape the way that we talk about women globally. And we're already at an impasse in the way that we're talking about women. And so we need to look at Paris as sort of a smaller sample for a bigger discussion that needs to happen. And, you know, women like Rokhaya have an expertise and need to be highlighted for that expertise. We don't need a bunch of white dudes on television talking about issues that, you know, we are very capable of talking about. So I think this book looks at how women are really seizing their place at the table and are changing the way that we look at the women of this city and how they influence it.
Well, on that note, we are going to have to unfortunately end. Thank you so much, Lindsey and Rokhaya, for being part of this discussion. I feel like every point could have been its own discussion. So we covered a lot of territory, but I think it introduced a lot of people in other places to a bigger conversation that's going on in France, and that hopefully will continue. Certainly, we've seen reverberations of what's happened in America, really even last weekend in France, of protests outside my house. So thank you again, both of you.